Well, again, good morning, and thank you all for being here. We're just delighted that the Chicago Council on Global Affairs thought that we would be a good partner and host here in Miami for them to present the report, the results, and the report on, as you know, the views of Latinos on U.S. foreign policy. By the way, before I start, the report is available, hard copy, outside, and it is available online as well, right? So you can go, I haven't coordinated this with our colleagues, but you can go to the Chicago, okay, good. You can go to the website and find the report there as well. As I said, we're just delighted to be hosting and partnering with them. I think that if you look at the results, the title, as you see from the screen, says Latino resembles other Americans. And we're going to hear our friends talk a little bit about that. But I think we also have some FIU professors here who work on polling and analysis, who are going to provide their own insight and maybe some interesting thoughts about how perhaps it doesn't resemble or how trends are moving in a certain direction. So we're very fortunate that in addition to presenting the results, we're going to have an opportunity to have FIU faculty give their thoughts and analysis about the report. And of course, we're going to end with your comments and questions at the end. I should have said from the beginning that my name is Frank Mora, and I'm the director of the Latin American and Caribbean Center. All the bagels were keeping me distracted. Here at FIU. So the bios are available, so I don't want to go through all the bios, but I do want to sort of just recognize some of the folks here that have joined us. And I'm going to go from my immediate towards the end. Not in the order they're going to speak, of course, but certainly in the order that they're at least seated. David Duckenfield is with the State Department, where he's the Deputy Assistant Secretary, and has been in that role since May of 2014. He can tell you a little bit about what he does as the DAS in his Office of Public Affairs, but he is very much involved in, as he says, touching people, reaching out to communities in the United States and elsewhere to talk about U.S. policy, not just in Latin America, but really around the world. Dave, as I said, started in 2014, but before then he was, and still lives, in Miami, and is a communications expert and an old friend. So David, thank you for being here. Michele is the Vice President at the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, Vice President for Studies. She was previously with the World Policy Institute, and she's a pretty prolific author, and I'm glad she's here to join us. She is going to, at the very end, Michele, right, bring this all together, I expect, at the end of the question and answer just before we close. Then next to her is Dina Smeltz, who will be giving the presentation of the report. She's a senior fellow for public opinion and foreign policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She does and has done this work, this kind of work, for some time and in different capacities. And so she's, as they say, an old pro, and so look forward to her remarks. Then next to Dina is a colleague, José Cruz, who is the Director of Research and visiting professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations. He has been and spends a lot of time also working on polling data, specifically LAPOP, the Latin American Public Opinion Project at Vanderbilt University. You might have seen him when we did the LAPOP project here in the fall, and works extensively on Central America and violence in Central America. And then our our other colleague, of course, the most senior professor, or one of the more senior professors. That's not meant to be a comment on age. It's meant to be experience. What's wrong with you people? Eduardo is a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at FIU. He is one of my predecessors as director of the Latin American and Caribbean Center. Professor Gamarra, I think, as you also know, does a lot of work on polling, not just in the United States, but in Latin America as well. So he also approaches this study from that perspective. So we've got two discussants who have quite a bit of a scholarly and practical experience in doing polling and analysis of polling. So with that, Dina, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you all for coming this morning. It's great to see you. I don't know how much you follow Chicago politics, but we just had a really interesting election for mayor in our city. In the first runoff, it was pretty unexpected that Rahm Emanuel faced some tough competition from Jesus Garcia, and it really brought to home kind of the impact of the Hispanic vote and the ability of the Hispanic vote to determine the course of an election at a very local level. So it was really interesting for us in Chicago to see that and discuss it. But of course, here in Miami, you've known this for quite some time, so it's not so new for you guys. But again, it did, as we're heading into the 2016 elections, policymakers and also political consultants have all taken notice of what happened in the 2012 election and how Hispanics really tilted the election toward President Obama, and so it's really a target audience now for a lot of campaigns. Then at the same time, the news about the recovering U.S. economy has shifted some of the emphasis away from domestic concerns and more toward foreign policy, and many people, many observers are writing that this actually might be an election where foreign policy really makes a difference, given the situation with ISIS and continuing crisis in Ukraine and seems like never-ending conflict in Syria. So we basically did a mashup of these two trends that we thought it would be interesting to look at how Hispanic Americans look at different foreign policy issues compared to other Americans, and where are they different and where are they similar. So I'm just gonna, the methodology of how we went about conducting the survey is actually on page 20 of the report, but I'll just mention quickly to set the scene that the surveys were conducted in May 2014. A total of over 2,000 adults were interviewed. This included about 500 Hispanics, and they were, Latinos could take the questions in Spanish or in English, it was their choice. And then the demographic breakdown is on page 18 in terms of age, political affiliation, and education. You'll notice also that it's a mostly Mexican sample because it's representative of the country as a whole, and that's what the census data show. So I think Eduardo is going to speak a little bit about the different nationalities that comprise the Latino community, but for our purposes, it would really, doesn't give a, we don't have a big enough sample of Cuban Americans, for example, to say anything with much confidence. So on the whole, what our data show is that actually Latinos and non-Latinos are very similar in their worldview and outlook for foreign policy. Majorities of both favor U.S. leadership in the world. Both think the U.S. is the most influential country in the world today, and both say the United States has a unique character that makes it the greatest country in the world. Both groups support a foreign policy that's multidimensional, that includes alliances, treaties, trade agreements, and dialogue with Cuba, as well as Iran and North Korea. They both see top threats similarly, with their major concerns about terrorism, nuclear proliferation, Iran's nuclear program, and cyber attacks. And in terms of goals, both consider protecting American jobs a top priority for U.S. foreign policy. So despite these broad similarities, there are 4 key differences where Latinos are different than other Americans. The first is not too surprising, it's about immigration. Latinos are not as threatened by large numbers of immigrants coming to the United States. They're less threatened than non-Latinos, and they are much less likely to say that controlling and reducing illegal immigration should be a top goal. Second, and this one was a little more surprising, a majority of Hispanics, 54%, compared to just 32% of non-Hispanics, think that climate change is a critical threat. This is more surprising because generally climate change is considered to be mainly a concern among affluent white liberals. And this was a little bit more against conventional wisdom. Third, about 6 in 10 Latinos compared to roughly 4 in 10 non-Latinos think combating world hunger should be a top priority. And finally, Latinos are much more positive than non-Latinos about the United Nations, specifically on performance in authorizing the use of force to maintain peace and security, imposing sanctions, resolving conflicts, and preventing nuclear proliferation. So one reason for these differences might be due to the way that Latinos get their information. Spanish language media tends to be broader in their worldview than English language media. So Latinos are probably more familiar and follow some of these issues more closely. Also, Latinos may live closer to disaster-prone or poverty-stricken areas. Latinos, for climate change, many work on agricultural issues, so they have more of a connection there. So these were some of the hypotheses that we came up with in terms of describing why, on these 4 key items, Latinos might be a little bit different. And I'm anxious to hear what my fellow panelists think of those speculations. So these results basically suggest that as Latino participation in the political arena increases, there might be greater calls for a foreign policy that has attention to humanitarian issues, to environmental issues, and that tries to put efforts forth in a multilateral context. And then our larger takeaway is that if you think of in the context that not many, but some Americans have the strong view that as our country changes and that as we have demographic shifts in this country, it may somehow affect our foreign policy values. Well, I think our survey shows that really there's not so much to worry about. Latinos share many of the same foreign policy preferences, and it's really a domestic focus, protecting American jobs, that is their top priority. And I think that is where I will end. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Frank. First, I want to thank the Chicago Council for doing this interesting research and that allows us to understand Latinos in the U.S. and actually poses this interesting challenge of trying to understand the implications of Latino views on foreign policy in general, on foreign policy. This is a really fascinating survey, fascinating work, and I hope we can continue seeing these kind of surveys on Latino communities, on foreign policy, and we can also, I hope we can work to contrast these with what Latin Americans, for instance, or citizens of other parts of the world are thinking on foreign policy. My comments will basically focus on looking at this survey from the point of view of somebody who have seen a lot of public opinion from Latin Americans, and try to contrast these views of Hispanics here in the U.S. with Latin Americans, with citizens in Latin America, and show how this connection between these views in Latin America and the views in Hispanics are basically showing a new kind of connection between the U.S. and Latin America. Since I'm very much familiar with the Latin America Public Opinion Project, I will be referring to that, as Franz said. And basically we'll touch on 3 points. One of them, I think, is sort of the most important, and this is that despite that the report underlines this idea that Latinos in the United States resemble other Americans in terms of their views on foreign policy, I think that it's even more interesting to see those differences and see how those differences are connected with some important characteristics of our current foreign policy nowadays, and how that is approaching us to Latin America as we speak. Actually, we saw that over the weekend, right? And I would say that's in some degree the result of the push, still, moderate push, but the push, after all, of Latinos or Hispanics in the U.S. So first, let me just say this. This vision that the U.S., this vision from Hispanics in the United States, that the U.S. is a leader nation that plays a key and important role in world politics, that is influential, and that it plays this positive role around the world, is an interesting view coming from Hispanics, especially because there seems to be the idea here sometimes that, with the arrival of, new migrants or Hispanics, they will bring different sort of values that, to some extent, as you may hear from some pundits or observers, may weaken the role of the U.S. in the world. I'm sorry. Actually, what we're seeing from what Hispanics say, Hispanics very much believe in the key role that the U.S. Can play and should play in the world, and also it shows to some extent, to the extent that it's possible to see through this data, that Hispanics also share these sort of values about democracy, freedoms, right? These other similarities also, that identifying sort of the main threats for the U.S. are very much in sync with the non-Hispanics Americans are saying. And basically, what we can say out of this is that in terms of how the U.S. is viewed and the role of the U.S. is viewed in the world, there are basically no differences. Now, the second point I want to make, and this is where I think is some of the most interesting things, is that these differences that have been outlined here, right, these differences between Hispanics Americans and non-Hispanics Americans, has to do, to some extent, with a political culture that can be traced back to, obviously, to Latin America, right? And this, let me just make a summary from doing surveys in Latin America, in analyzing surveys in Latin America for many years. So let me make a summary of what are the main points or what are the main differences in terms of political culture between the U.S. and Latin America in general terms, as far as I can tell. One has to do with, one of the differences has to do with the role of the state. In Latin America, the state is seen as an important actor, and usually is viewed as it has to play an important role in public life. Right. There is a huge difference, and it's a key difference with political culture in the U.S. The U.S., the role of the state has to be rather minimal. It plays a marginal role, and it has to play a marginal role in public life, and it sets two different views of the world. The second important difference has to do with political tolerance. In general, Americans tend to be more tolerant than Latin American. And the third point has to do with how Latin Americans view themselves in relation to the world. And Latin Americans tend to see themselves more as part or as citizens of the world than Americans do, right? As a historian from Latin America, Alan Ruquier, said, Latin Americans basically turn their backs on their own neighbors, but look at Europe, look at the US, look everywhere else in the world, right? And you can see that in Latin America, but you can see that to some extent in Hispanics here in the United States. I mean, Hispanics here in the United States bring that sort of legacy of looking out, looking at the world, still looking at the world, without diminishing the role of the United States. So what we see in the case of Hispanics, if we take those, especially those traits that have to do with the role of the state and their citizenship of the world, basically what you're seeing from Hispanics in the U.S. is this view that the U.S. is exceptional, indeed, but shouldn't be isolated. The U.S. is an important country and is an influential and should be a leader in the world, but, and this is an important difference where I think in relation to other Americans is, but it shouldn't be isolated. We should engage in the world. And we should engage in the world as the data clearly shows using multilateralism, right? Using United Nations. United Nations is big. The role of the United Nations is big in the opinions of Hispanic Americans, which you don't find in the rest of Americans. And this takes me to the third point. And the third point is that, and Dina mentioned this, if we assume that the Hispanics will increasingly play an important role in domestic politics here in the United States, we can also expect that those views to trickle down in our own foreign policy. And I would say we're even looking at that to some extent now. If you think about one of the main characteristics of the current foreign policy, Obama foreign policy in terms of engaging in the world, multilateralism, right? The importance of environmental issues, climate change, right? It's another thing important for Latinos. Immigration, indeed. I mean, if you think about that, and if you think what just happened in the summit this weekend, basically it was more like Obama was, I'll say this very carefully, Obama was talking to his constituency to some extent, right? Because he was talking about engaging Latin America in a different way, in which usually the U.S. has been seen playing its role in the world, right? Through the United Nations, through multilateralism, favoring immigration, and an important attention to climate change. And these are things that Hispanics here in the United States are underlying. So if you think about that, we already are seeing, to some extent, that influence of Hispanics, and we can expect to see that influence of Hispanics in the near future. I usually tell my students of international relations in Latin America that I always surprised how every city I visit in Latin America, there is always a plaza, a street called Kennedy or Roosevelt, right? And you know why, right? There was a good neighbor policy, Alliance for Progress. We don't find too many Reagan plazas or Nixon plazas, right?
There's even a Lincoln, a bust of Abraham
yes,
Lincoln in Cuba.
Lincoln too, yeah. But the Kennedys and the Roosevelt area. So what I would say is that maybe we will expect to some extent to see also Obama plazas and streets in the near future. So I'll end with this. Thank you.
Well, I also want to thank the Chicago Council and Frank for asking me to participate in this panel. I'm very pleased to be here, and especially to follow such interesting ideas and a very interesting poll. I'm going to make a few comments, a couple at the outset about the methodology that I think are important both for you and for my students, some of whom are here. Let me start with that second observation. This is a poll that I think many students and professors and pollsters, I'm sorry, should be forced to read the methodology section of this, because it is absolutely the most clear methodology I have ever seen written up. All right, you know, most of us pollsters, what we do is we assume that everybody knows a little bit about statistics, and so but this one does a phenomenal job of explaining every last detail of how you went about doing the poll, and I think it's very much appreciated. Okay. Having said that, of course, the poll has, as you noted, Dina, some shortcomings, largely because it's a small sample, all right, and because you have an oversample of Mexicans to reflect the national trend, and therefore, while you have a national, the ability to generalize nationally, and I think it's correct, your sample doesn't allow you to make some very clear-cut observations about groups that have had an important role in this country, and I think, and I think in that sense, I would suggest that that in the future, hopefully you can get the funding for it, but a much larger sample would be very important, and perhaps oversampling, especially among groups that have played a larger role, right? And in the context, especially of what's happening in the world today with Cuba, it would have been really interesting to have a larger sample of Cuban Americans. So having said that, then let me just make a couple of observations that I've been thinking about relative to your poll, and that is, you start out. Let me before I do that, let me just say, your poll is doing something really very important, and that is you are assuming that we as Latinos are important. Okay. And I'm not so sure that everybody else is in agreement with that. Now, you talk to Jorge Ramos at Univision, he's been saying we're important for a long time, that we've been determining the outcome of elections, that we're, but the data really doesn't bear that out. And, and what we find, in fact, is that Latinos are still under-registered, they undervote, right? And so we really aren't determining outcomes of elections yet, right? But we do know that the demographic shift is occurring, and that within the next 20 to 30 years, there will be no majority in this country, and Hispanics will be the largest minority. Now, whether that translates into a specific influence, both at the domestic level or in terms of international policy, I think is yet to be seen, especially because, what we now know is that of 25 million Americans eligible to vote, only about 12 million vote. All right. Now, and that's reflective only of national elections. It's not reflective of midterm elections. In midterm elections, we basically don't show up. All right. And the results, of course, are demonstrated. So if you want to kind of look at this counterfactually, yes, we do have an impact. The fact that we don't show up has given us the kind of Congress that we currently have, all right? And that is an impact of Latino activity. We're there, we have the votes, we have the numbers, but we're really having a very negative impact on American at least on governing American politics. Okay, so and I've just revealed my political colors doing that. So, all right, now let me then basically go to my formal remarks, I guess. A few years ago, Harry Pachon and co-edited a book, a very, in fact, probably the only one, on are Latinos important in the articulation of foreign policy? And I would strongly urge both students and us to go back and reread that book. I was trying to find my copy, I couldn't, so I'm sure it's out there somewhere. But I was struck when I attended that conference. We began sort of thinking about what groups have had influence in the making of American foreign policy. And I think it was Jorge Dominguez who sort of went back and he said, well, look, I think we have to go back to the Alien and Sedition Act. The first Alien and Sedition Act was largely based on the hypothesis that these groups of foreigners would have a negative impact in undermining American foreign policy because even as citizens they would be speaking for their countries and so on. And so over the last couple of centuries, in fact, we have really been worried about what the French, the Germans, the Italians, in different periods, how influential they would be in the articulation of foreign policy. Now, today, perhaps we're looking at Latinos largely because we're so many, right? We now, Jorge Duani can probably tell us exactly how many we are. I think we're about 55 million. I guess that's the projection, right? And but also, I think we've had relatively successful lobbying efforts on the part of a couple of groups. All right, and those are the groups that I'd like to focus on just for a moment. But the reality is that no Latino group in the United States has ever supported an enemy of the United States. Okay, and yet a lot of the reaction to Latinos today, in some measure, kind of assumes that we're going to be in bed with the enemy, right? And certainly not with terrorists, but we've had a couple of Latinos that have been arrested on this, but we haven't made the broad category of support. But what in fact we're finding, as your poll demonstrates, is really quite interesting. And Jose Miguel said it as well. Latinos are very curiously very, very American, very, very pro-American across the board. And what I thought Jose Miguel was going to say, that this contrasts noticeably with those of us who are back in our own countries, because being anti-American is a national pastime in just about every country. Maybe curiously the Dominican Republic not, but Mexico certainly, Argentina, despite the relaciones carnales under men, and very, very anti-American. All right. Now, at the same time, however, when we polled through the Iberobarometro, and we did this poll several years running, when we asked about George Bush, for example, George W. was not very popular, and so Fidel was much more popular than George W. But when we asked, about Obama, beginning in 2008, Obama has consistently polled better than the presidents of countries, and we saw this in the results of the poll that Ben Dixon and Fernando did over the last couple of weeks. So we, for example, polled when Chavez was alive, Obama was more popular than Chavez in Venezuela, right? And that I think leads us to this very contradictory kind of perception. But there's another thing also, and which is what I kind of call it the inverted civic culture. When you look, for example, at support for institutions, all right? You look, for example, that nationally today, the U.S. Congress is at a historic low. I think it reached 9% in one poll, right? Not among Latinos, all right? Latinos have the highest rate of support for all institutions, including the police. Now, after all these shootings, I don't know if that's going to be the case, but overall, Latinos in polling are above the average American in support for political institutions. So I think, you know, this is kind of an interesting dimension of those of us who are here, because I'm actually reminded of when I first arrived here, and many, many years ago, as Frank has already pointed out. One of the questions that reporters always used to ask me, because I was perceived as being anti-American, right? And the question would always be, why do you Latinos come to the United States and you're so anti-American in the U.S., right? Your poll, and most of the polling I've done, actually demonstrates quite the opposite. Only a few professors are anti-American, right? But the majority of Latinos are not, and that I think is an important. Okay, now if you take into consideration your assumption that this poll is important because Latinos will be important in the formulation of foreign policy, the historical record doesn't tell us that. I mean, what it tells us is that there are a few groups that have been important. And who has been important? Puerto Ricans in the 1950s and 60s perhaps were somewhat important, right? Mexican Americans have historically not been important. In fact, one might say that perhaps only across the border you might have some influence, but generally in terms of national policy, very little influence by Mexican Americans. And so, you know, it comes to the question of Cuban Americans. And Cuban Americans, we have always seen, you know, Cuban Americans followed the example, really after 1980 or so, followed the example of the Israeli lobby and became really the group, you know, the most excellent group in terms of really having an influence on the making of American foreign policy. But I think now, you know, with the retrospective that we have, and I know we're in Miami, and I know that what I'm going to say may sound a little dangerous, but frankly, you know, when you look at the historical record, Cuban Americans have not had as much influence as we believe that they have had, all right? And, you know, even though we constantly refer to this, that Cuban Americans have actually determined how American foreign policy toward, yes, the Cold War was important, but American foreign policy, you know, probably had more to do with Fidel than with Cuban Americans, right? It had to do with the Soviet Union more than Cuban Americans. When you look at Cuban American lobby, and when you look at where they really did have an impact, let's take a look at a couple of cases. Immigration policy, in fact, Cuban Americans over the last 20 years have been complaining about immigration policy, right? Even though they are net beneficiaries of American foreign policy, right? But from the very beginning, Cuban Americans probably had very little in terms of the making of immigration policy. After 1980, in fact, if you look at the 94 restrictions, you know, today there are more Dominicans coming into the United States than Cuban Americans, right? And if you look at the rate from 2010 forward, Dominicans are the fastest growing Caribbean group in the United States. And so, you know, part of it is because we have a specific quota for Cuban Americans coming into this country. The second thing, if you look at Helms-Burton, right, which at least I would like to have seen never implemented, not even part of it, but the fact that most of it has not been implemented really speaks to the weakness of Cuban American influence, not to the strength of Cuban American influence, right? I mean, if Cuban Americans had really been strong, the whole brunt of it would have already been in place. Now, the dramatic shift that we have seen related to Cuba over the last few weeks, few months, all right, again may show us how very little influence Cuban Americans today have in the making of foreign policy, right? And although there are demographic trends that are changing and so on, and which we've noted in different polls, right? The reality is that, you know, again, I want to throw this out as a challenge, that maybe we've spent a lot of time, you know, talking about how influential Cubans were in the making of foreign policy, but the concrete evidence is that probably you weren't, okay? Now, let me just move very quickly here to a couple of things that my overall conclusion then is that, you know, Latinos lack a voice in U.S. foreign policy. We have historically lacked a voice in foreign policy, right? We don't have voice, we don't have participation, and we also don't have representation, all right? And I think that this happens for a number of reasons. and these, you know, Jorge Dominguez has been pointing this out for at least 2 decades. First is that we don't have a shared foreign policy agenda among Latino groups in the United States. You know, I see this often with my students. You know, we have Venezuelans, Colombians, you know, Peruvians now in here, and Cuban Americans, and of course Mexicans. And you know, in fact, when we send our Cuban American students on the Latino Leadership Opportunity Program, for example, we used to send our Cuban American students to interact with Mexican students and Puerto Rican students. It was always interesting to see the results. Cuban American students would come back and would say, "Man, those Puerto Ricans are a bunch of communists, and the Mexicans certainly don't like us." You know, so we have never had this unity of vision about foreign policy, right? Now we're all pro-Americans, and on the issues that you polled, certainly there's consensus, but there is no such thing as a Latino view of foreign policy that would affect us, right? The other thing that is important is that, you know, we have, and I'm saying this with Frank here, and you know, we've also lacked a lot of representation at the highest levels of American foreign policy making. All right, it improved, and it has improved significantly during the Obama administration, and I think Frank is an example of that, right? But still today, if you look around, you know, who are our ambassadors in Latin America today, right? Probably we have more Latinos as ambassadors today than we have ever had, right? Than we have ever had. I mean, we've got Liliana Ayalde in Brazil. We've got, pardon me? Ponte in El Salvador. We've got Romero in Jamaica and so on. I think there's about 5 or 6. But it really is quite remarkable that we have not had much representation at the highest level of American foreign policy making, right? And then let me just conclude, because I've already exceeded my time, you know, and this is frankly, because David is here and likes to hear a lot about the diaspora issues, you know, this idea that the diaspora has a lot of influence, right? Other diasporas, you know, the Haitian diaspora and so on and so forth. You know, I think we haven't looked very much at one aspect of diasporas that is really influential and which actually you have polled on, and that has to do with the impact of remittances, all right? I mean, remittances do wonders in terms of changing the attitude of people abroad about us, right? And I think more work needs to be done on the significance of remittances. And it also tells us something quite striking. You know, we're having Leonel Fernandez here this afternoon, and one of the things that we now understand, because, you know, we've had President Uribe came here. You know, we've had, I mean, all kinds of the Haitian candidates are always here. You know, why are they here? Well, partially it's because they're getting money from the diaspora to go, you know, for their politics at home. But what's interesting, and I've noticed, is that they come here because they also fundraise from other communities, right? So the Cuban community, for example, is extraordinary at funding Latin American candidates, all right? That I know from experience. But what we also know is that, you know, there's a very interesting observation to conclude with. When, and in fact, I was listening to the Cuba poll being analyzed on NPR yesterday by Guillermo Grenier, one of the authors, and he was saying something very interesting. If you look at Cuban Americans after 2000, their rate of citizenship is much slower, all right, and their rate of political participation is much lower as well, all right? And this doesn't mean that they're focused solely at home, right? I mean, they're, you know, because if you look at this also in terms of Dominicans or Colombians and so on, right? I mean, this big focus on getting Dominicans or Colombians to vote. They have the right to vote here. But you know what the turnout rate is for the Colombian diaspora? It's almost like the turnout here, Frank. All right? You know, it's under 20%. All right? Very few Colombians vote in their national elections. Dominicans vote even less. So most Dominicans and most Colombians have already made the shift toward being Americans. But the problem with them is that they were apathetic at home and did not vote unless we forced them to vote through compulsory electoral laws, because laws are not compulsory here, we're not getting Hispanics to vote out here. Okay? All right. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That was great, Eduardo. It's wonderful when Eduardo makes news.
Okay, well, I'll just sort of wrap it up here and try to be somewhat brief so we have some time for the questions and answers. I thought, you know, my contribution to this panel could be just to give a little overview of you know, what the State Department does in terms of domestic outreach and why this kind of poll is important to those efforts. So I'll just take a step back and just say that my role in the sort of lead foreign policy agency of the U.S. government is a little sort of counterintuitive, some would think, in the sense that, you know, we have over 280 embassies and consulates around the world in over 170 some countries, you know, advancing the foreign policy, national security interests of the U.S. government and its American people. So we were inherently outwardly focused, right, on U.S. foreign policy. But my office is actually internally focused. I run domestic outreach, the Office of Public Engagement, and that's engaging with the American public and engaging with elected state and local elected officials. So and when I tell people that in the State Department, sometimes they look at me sort of cross-eyed, and like, what are you, you know, you're a duck out of water here. But I think if you look at it from the perspective of Secretary Kerry and the administration, you know, we're definitely onto something, and it's important. If you accept the premise that we do, that at the end of the day, that the American public are really, in their opinions, are really the arbiters of foreign policy, and what the American public thinks matters and definitely influences our foreign policy, then you understand why it's important to have domestic outreach, and you understand why this poll is very important, as we understand sort of the rising majority of Hispanics in the United States, and a group that hasn't really been polled or understood in terms of foreign policy. In terms of voting and how much they go out, and slicing and dicing in terms of commercially how to sell, you know, widgets and everything has been polled incessantly, but not towards, you know, foreign policy, which is important to us. And you know, as Secretary Kerry said in one of his first speech, actually a few years ago when he took on the job at the University of Virginia, you know, foreign policy isn't foreign, and there's a big push at the State Department to begin this, or to continue, I guess, this sort of outreach to the American public. And one of the reasons they brought me on board, in particular in this job, was my background in outreach to Hispanic communities, because the State Department understood that that was one thing we were sorely lacking in, is how to reach out to Hispanic communities who are having an outside influence, and particularly in their countries, especially first generation in the countries of origin, as we sort of become an increasingly hyphenated country, you know, Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, Colombian Americans, and as the world becomes increasingly interconnected, and how those ties that were often lost at the water's edge, you know, 100 years ago, or at Ellis Island, just they aren't, and their communication continues. And just looking at Mexican Americans, leave Miami for a second, you know, over 50% of Mexican Americans, or Mexicans rather, have visited the United States, which is kind of astounding. And over 40%, almost half of Mexicans, have family in the United States. So 4 out of 10. So that's astounding, and there's no way to get around the sort of influence. You can just look at what the Mexican government does in terms of the number of councils they have around the country, and how they do all the outreach and the voting, allowing them to vote in Mexico. There's no way of getting around the influence that Mexican Americans have on Mexican politics, really, and what's going on down there. So, you know, having this kind of data is very important. We actually have a shop in the State Department called the Intelligence and Research, where Dina worked for a number of years, which is very important because it informs how we view the world. We do polling throughout the world to understand the audiences we're speaking to. So, beyond the sort of government to government relations, what is the public in different countries around the world, what are they thinking? Because as well as in the United States, domestic audiences inform foreign policy. It holds true around the world. But INR doesn't really do domestic polling. So that's where studies like this come into play, and it's very important. So I'm glad that the Chicago Council undertook this study. And I guess I want to just maybe point out a couple of things that we're doing as the State Department to engage this diaspora audience in a real way. And we have all these different sort of special rep offices that people have never heard of, but actually do important things. At least I think so. And one of those is the Global Partnerships Initiative. And to sort of put that in perspective, the Global Partnerships Initiative is a shop inside the State Department that, for lack of a better term, is basically a public-private partnership office. And what they do is they help push our sort of diplomatic ties across the world by partnering with the private sector in the United States and sometimes private sector abroad, together with the State Department to encourage entrepreneurship, volunteerism, innovation overseas. So one of the concepts that they do is called the IDEA group. And IDEA is focused around engaging the Hispanic diaspora, typically first generation, maybe second generation, and saying, you still have very strong ties in your country of origin. But you've also come here and picked up a lot of skill sets or Americanisms that could really translate well and help the people in their country of origin, such as entrepreneurship, philanthropy, innovation, technology. And so how do we sort of team up with these groups and create a platform where they can go back and sort of help young entrepreneurs in those countries start new businesses? And that's one example of the kind of the collaboration we're doing with diaspora groups. And of course, across the board, part of my job is just to go, literally fly around the country and speak with diaspora groups, with stakeholders on different issues from Ebola to Ukraine, and talking and speaking on the sort of our position and our foreign policy position on those different issues. And I also want to just talk a little bit about the findings and what is enlightening and it's actually, it comes across, I think, as a very an affirmation of what José was talking about in terms of our policy abroad. And first talking about immigration and the importance of immigration. That immigration is always a tricky one, because when you talk about a foreign policy issue, it's not really foreign policy. It's actually domestic policy in the sense that immigrants are in the United States. But it becomes a foreign policy issue, and one that's important and one that involves the diaspora groups when you have occasions like we had last summer with the whole unaccompanied minor crisis in Central America. And how do you sort of stem that flow when there's a lot of misinformation getting out about the president's executive order and what it really means? So certain elements are taking advantage of the executive order and the confusion that it sort of caused in Central America to say that all you had to do was show up and then you would be accepted with welcoming arms. So that wasn't the case. So, and one of the things we did, of course, we had huge interagency meetings and trying to figure out, but one of the first things we did was really reaching out to the sort of Central American communities, community groups and thought leaders in those communities and just to make sure that they communicate back to their hometowns and to their families what the reality was on the ground. And then obviously that was one of the first steps, and then the president has since and Congress has since designated a $1 billion fund to help out in Central America, and just recently, or during last week, in the summit, another $68 million to help out with sort of strengthening job growth and sort of criminality element, and to help strengthen the actual civil society in the what they call the Northern Triangle in Central America, to sort of stem that flow. But that's it's important to know, and it's, even though it's an obvious one, that Hispanics are definitely focused on immigration and sort of over-index on its importance. And Jose stole a little bit of my thunder here too, talking about climate change. That is something that is critically important, top 2, 3, I would say, in terms of our foreign policy agenda, even with all the craziness that's going on in the world. And why? Because it's something that threatens, you know, all of us globally. You know, it threatens Florida a lot, even though, I shouldn't say this, but even though the governor won't let them use the word climate change in their talking points. But, and the president just last week was talking about, you know, climate resilient energy development at the summit. You know, I think everyone knows what we did last year with China, sort of voluntary reductions with China. You know, we're between China and ourselves and India, you know, some of the top 3 or 4 producers of pollution in the world. And even with the sort of trade agreements that we're doing, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a lot of that is predicated, or part of the deal has a huge environmental element to it, that to be part of this trade agreement you have to abide by certain environmental standards. So it's very reassuring to know that Hispanics are on board and understand the importance of climate change. And I'd say finally, as Jose also mentioned, the importance of multilateralism. You know, we live in a very complicated world, and we have to work together in many instances to push our foreign policy goals ahead. And you know, look no further than the Iran talks right now, the P5+1. That's extreme multilateral. We've been together since 2006 working on that, and we've at least have come up with a framework of an understanding that would hopefully work towards a deal by the end of June. And also with our counter ISIL efforts in the Middle East, that's also very multilateral, working with a lot of nations in the region as well as Europeans to sort of stem the tide of ISIS. So multilateralism is the reality of the world we live in. It makes us more powerful, not less powerful. And again, a great trend that we see in the study, of the importance. So that's, again, reaffirming to see that is the case as this emerging majority, you know, comes in the next 20 years to become, you know, the largest minority group in the United States. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back over to Frank.
Thank you. Thank you, David. We have a good amount of time. I think there's a lot to discuss here, to chew on. So do we have a mic, Sally? So just raise your hand. We'll come to you. Identify yourself, and then ask your question, make your comment. So Alejandro was over here a second ago.
Very much for this. Nora Gomez for the Miami Herald and El Nuevo Herald. I wonder if Frank and David could address a little more about how do you think this perceived change of opinions of Latinos and Cuban Americans in terms of foreign policy has played out a role in the new Cuba policy and also in Obama's message to Latin American countries during the summit? Maybe it's not only regarding this specific poll, but a range of polls we have seen lately.
Okay, so I'm going to put my hat on as an academic and not as a... I think the president has been wanting to do this for some time. Not only because of a realization that attitudes towards U.S. policy have changed, right? But because he thought that this is the most effective way to achieve our foreign policy interests and objectives in Cuba and in the region, right? Of course it helps, I think, Nora, as we've seen, and Eduardo and others in the Cuba poll have shown this over time, that attitudes have been changing for a period of time. I don't have the Cuba poll with me, but I think it's clear that poll that FIU, Eduardo, and other entities, Pew, I think, right, Eduardo, have shown attitudes changing over time. And I think as any good politician, I think it's clear that that has to be, is a part of what I thought would be, he thinks, or the administration thought would be the opportune moment. But I think that is not, and I want to emphasize that, that is not the driving reason or force why the president decided to make a change in December 17th. I think it has to do with what works in the bilateral, as well as greater, more strategic reasons having to do with our relationship with Latin America. David?
Yeah, I'll echo that to a certain extent. I'll say that, yes, the polls both here and the recent poll in Cuba showing overwhelming support for engagement with the Cuban government is important and perhaps a reaffirmation of the president's policies. But at the end of the day, the decision was made that after 50 years of a policy that wasn't working, it was time to change course and to really look towards engaging and helping out the Cuban people by the moves that have been made, by reestablishing diplomatic relations, by normalizing relations, by reaching out directly, speaking to Eduardo's comment with remittances, the power of remittances, increasing remittances to the island, by helping open communications to the island, by supporting local entrepreneurs. Back to my point with the Global Partnerships Initiative and what they're trying to do, opening up, helping out entrepreneurs on the island to really open up that sector of the economy and support the Cuban people. So I think this is, obviously it's good news. It's a reaffirmation of a policy that we think will really lead to a more stable, prosperous, and democratic Cuba.
You have a mic right here? Alejandro, you had a question. Do you have but we're going to go here first, and then we'll come back to you. Right there.
Hi, Pedro Manrique, a student at Florida International University. My question is to Dr. Gamarra. You talk about a lack of representation in the Hispanic community and a lack of influence in the foreign policy making process. My question to you is, could you comment a little bit on those terms, Hispanic and Latino, and do you think that the lack of internalization of a Hispanic identity, thank you, within the Hispanics is part of that lack of a common agenda towards the formulation of foreign policy?
As most people who have written on this, and again, going back, and I want to again point out that study by Harry Pachon, we don't have a common foreign policy agenda, partially because, Cuban Americans like to be called Cuban Americans. Colombian Americans like to be called Colombian Americans, and we have a debate, as you just pointed out. I mean, are we Hispanics? And there are a lot of people who say Hispanics is the nice way of saying Latino kind of conjures up some politicized way of looking at us, and and we're using now those terms interchangeably. But what we do know from from some of the polling, more in-depth polling, and this goes back again to the observation about sample size. Most of the polling that has been done on Latinos in the United States has been very, very, very small samples. And so we really don't have, Frank, this is something we should do with the Chicago Council, but we really need a big poll, and we also need some really good, I think, qualitative kind of studies that really pursue this kind of, because there is a lot of literature even on whether you're a Latino or whether you're a Hispanic, but I don't think we really fully understand the differences in the different groups and the similarities, And let me again be provocative for just a moment. Look, we assume, for example, that Cuban Americans are Republicans, and we have for a long time, right? And our colleague and senator who just announced, makes a big point about Obamacare, for example, right? And yet we're finding now, evidence from our local community, in fact, the news media has done a pretty good job on this, that older Cuban Americans like Obamacare, okay? And they are also the most steadfast, supporters of somebody like Marco Rubio, or at least. So I think we don't know enough, and that's why I think we need more of these studies, not less, and we need to make these samples bigger and much deeper. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alejandro Alvarado. I'm now a political consultant, and before I used to be a professor at FIU School of Communications. And I had a question for Eduardo, for the panel, but Eduardo gave basically the answer that I was looking for, that there's not such a thing as uniformity among Hispanics. And I think that for all of you that are looking for information about Hispanics, the Pew Hispanic Center has done an amazing job. And they did several surveys related to foreign policy back in 2003 when the war in Iraq. There was a follow-up of the reactions, very, very following the polls of how Hispanics reacted among the decisions and among the war by itself. And it was interesting to see how they follow the mainstream trend and how they behave accordingly to the way that Americans were doing in the war. So if they were winning, they were for it. If they were losing, they were not necessarily for it. So, but it was basically the same behavior. What I have a question specifically towards the recent announcement of the opening relations with Cuba. If you have any feedback of how the different communities are reacting. Because we have that Cuban Americans might or might not support the policy, but I might think that Mexicans, for example, in the West Coast are in favor of the opening relationship with Cuba because of the role that Mexicans have played in the relationship between with Cuba, supporting Cuba since the beginning, and there's a different perception of the problem.
Thank you, Alejandro. Dina, want to make a comment about that, or?
Yeah, I haven't seen any polling since any polling of American Latinos since the announcement has been made. And going back to Eduardo's point, to make that segmentation of Mexicans on the West Coast, and the kind of deep dive that you're talking about, we would again need, at least like 2,000, a sample of at least 2,000, I would say, or a specialized sample where we just look at clusters, or so that you can draw the sample so that you get the same number to compare across different groups. We could do that too. But anyway, I haven't seen anything like that yet, and I'm sure that there will be another wave of polls coming out soon, and we're going to be including it in our 2015 survey, but we don't have the booster sample this time.
Eduardo, do you want to add something?
No, I think Dina's done I think it just follows that Mexicans are likely to be like the rest of us, all right, like the rest of the national polls, and they're probably very, very supportive. And I think we also need to I think some of the polling on Cuban Americans has shown a very interesting trend. So, but I would say that Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and other Latinos, I don't know, maybe the Venezuelan, you know, the Venezuelan Doralzuela cluster, you know, might give us a different approach. But I think overall, other Latinos, including Mexicans, are very supportive of
Yeah, as are Americans.
I mean, but that's just a, you know, it's a
And
hypothesis.
Other Americans,
I don't know.
yeah.
So,
I just also wanted to comment too that we made several points about how the Latinos seem to follow the general trend of the general public in the U.S. And I think that that's what you find among I did some work on immigrant communities in Europe, and it was similar. That, you know, it's a partially assimilation and absorbing values from the community. And if you're new, you know, often the immigrant communities are more pro-American than the other Americans who have been here for generations. So that's kind of a normal immigrant ethos as well. Mm-hmm. Right, right.
Mexicans are not supportive of any intervention because of our culture in foreign policy.
Right.
So for me it was amazing to see, oh, okay, so Mexicans are becoming interventionists. when they got to the United States, and the polling was 60 to 68% of Mexicans were or Hispanic were supportive. So in Mexico, which made 62, 63% of the population were supportive of the United States.
And that was probably after the troops were sent. Usually, yeah, so usually there's that rallying effect once intervention is made, so they were following. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Let me,
Frank, just
Yeah, go ahead.
on this particular issue, and again, it would be, you know, when we asked in the early, maybe 2005 or so, we did a national poll here with mainly of Hispanics, but it was a small sample, and support for Iraq, and it was sort of following all of the Pew studies. But one of the things that we found, which is very interesting, very high support among Latinos. Why? Because their relatives were there.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's something that I think we need to understand, that, I mean, a large portion of our armed forces are, you know, our compatriots. So, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Livio Zanardo. I was born and raised in Venezuela. I'm a junior international relations major here at FIU. And it's really interesting you bring up this thing about the Mexicans becoming interventionists, because my question is about a possible change in political culture. As you have all mentioned to some extent, that the Latin Americans who immigrate to the United States pretty much export their political culture, which is reflected on their overall turnouts when it comes to elections. So my question is really all across the board, for everyone all across the board. Could we expect a change in political culture of Latinos being more involved in elections and being more politically involved, so that we can, so that our perspectives and our views could reflect more on U.S. foreign policy specifically, as it is more relevant to this panel?
Miguel, why don't we start with you?
The honest answer is I don't know. I think we can I think we can see more involvement. I'm not sure about what my friend Eduardo here said in a moment ago, that Hispanics here tend to reflect their low participation that we see in their countries. For instance, Colombians who tend to participate very low, or Salvadorians who tend to participate very low. But it is my impression, but this is without data at all, it's just anecdotal experience, is that those, some of these communities who move here, once they move here, and to some extent they realize the importance of the vote, because in some areas they can really make changes, at least at the local level, something that they don't actually perceive that well-being back in Latin America. I think that sometimes increases their own participation here. So I will say, I mean, having said that, I really don't know, but I will expect that because of those experiences of coming to a country in which participating politically makes make some difference, we could expect some sort of increase in terms of participation. So let me just take just a minute just to reinforce some of the points that Eduardo just said about, you know, these differences between local communities regarding the interventionism of the U.S. in other countries as opposed to Americans, right? And I remember an interesting poll that was done during the war in Iraq in El Salvador, and as some of you may know, El Salvador participated in basically contributed with troops and I can't remember exactly what was this poll, but it showed they polled back in El Salvador, and they showed that most Salvadorians were against the intervention over there, except for one group, and this group was those who have relatives here in the United States. Right? And that talks to what Eduardo said. Why? Because those who have relatives in the United States or have families here who actually have relatives in the armed forces, actually. And that was part of the connection. So the differences that you see attest to the process of assimilation that the Hispanics are undergoing here, actually. And the participation in the armed forces is a great channel of assimilation of Hispanics here in the U.S.
Yes, right here? Or why don't we go there and then come back to you? Okay.
Hi, my name is Yusuf Alamai. I'm a student here in FIU. My question is a bit more on the broader picture here. It just looks like whenever the U.S. has a bad image, it sides with a country. And it's been siding with Europe mostly, but ever since the Iraq War, and the image has just been dropping. So now we see it getting closer to Latin America. So is that move because of how the Middle East is crumbling a little bit, and a lot of the polls show that a lot of countries are not supporting some of the war tactics that the U.S. are using. Do you think that the U.S. is getting close into Latin America to just get an ally in the future, or get a stronger, tighter bond than it used to have before?
Ready on the panel?
I'll just say that we don't. The United States government doesn't segment its foreign policy and sort of go with certain groups or regions because they're falling out of favor in other parts of the world with other. That's just not how the foreign policy is formulated. And day in and day out and throughout all our missions around the world, we are always looking out for what's in the best national security interests of the American people and of this country, and that is how policy is formulated both individually in individual countries and in regions as well.
Right here, go ahead.
Hello. I want to thank you, everyone, for the discussion and the informative style of every one of your statements. My name is Rudy Sante. I'm an international relations student. I'm a junior. I'm originally from Colombia and also a political asylee. My understanding of the politics in Latin America tends to be different. I'm worried about the results of a polling that takes in consideration certain segment of the Hispanic community who was probably, and I'm going to ask you, is this made in English or in Spanish to begin with? Was it, no, what's it, the poll was taken.
Oh, do you mean the questionnaire?
Yeah.
Oh, it was in both. The respondents could choose whether they wanted to take it in English or in Spanish, and 187 of the 500 took it in Spanish.
Were any difference in the people?
We didn't get a chance to look that closely at it, but the one question we did not have, and this there were so many points that Eduardo and Jose Miguel that I wanted to follow up on, but two questions. We didn't ask whether people were native born or born here in the U.S. or born abroad, and we didn't ask what year they came. And so some people, one thing we could do is look at those 187 and guess that they are probably not native born. And then there were some differences that another colleague of ours analyzed, but I don't have those right now.
Because my preoccupation is that a lot of the Hispanic community takes their news from Univision, which is a great, I don't know if I'm offending anyone who works for Univision here, but the take of Univision is one that is popular and it sells. And their understanding of my friends about politics is that from whomever is on the news on that night, which is kind of like very simplistic. Then there is the Telemundo, which is more neutral, but still neutral. And if someone tends to take a more maybe ideological position, it tends to be maybe not overlooked, but demonized in a way that it is not, especially in Miami. Somebody tends to think in a way that's probably just proper as individual is not welcome. So the responses you get also when you're filing this application for American citizenship, you have to, there's some questions there. Some of them could be even intimidated, asking you about your political leanings. And therefore, from that point on, you become what that questionnaire invites you to or guides you to become. I just wanted to make those remarks in terms of, I don't think it's monolithic. I don't think Colombian American thinks just one way, and Venezuelans too. Although here in Miami tends to happen that they express their concerns in a really monolithic way. What is happening in Latin America? I think this is my question. Maybe I just go to my question and ask if what's happening in Latin America today reflects more of what the general public in Latin America wants, and if this is going to affect the view of what the Hispanic Americans think as a whole, not just the ones here, but the ones over there.
Let's go to Jose Miguel.
Yeah, as I said, to some extent, right? You can establish some similarities between the communities of Hispanics here and those in Latin Americans. There are, as I mentioned, there are certain traits that are similar. For instance, I mentioned the role of the state, for instance, and actually the survey here has interesting data showing how, for instance, Hispanics here tend to be more for healthcare, for state more interventionist, let's say, in domestic issues than typical American. Well, that's something that you find very strongly in Latin America, right? So those are things that you can establish some similarities between community here and Latin Americans.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of the program. Michele, you have the toughest job of bringing this all together. So I look forward to your comments.
Hey, well, it's been fascinating. Listen to this. I already was excited about the material, but this is one of these great conversations that makes me even more excited about what we're doing and looking forward to delving into it even deeper. I wanted to just quickly come up with a couple of summaries of the things we've been talking about and a couple of paradoxes that came out in the discussion. Just to summarize the events, I think one of the big things that came out was that Latinos in the U.S. are very pro-American. Jose Miguel talked about how that comes from a sort of Latin American tendency to have very strong support for institutions, but also great respect for certain American leaders, like the Kennedy and the Roosevelt avenues and plazas across Latin America. Eduardo made the point that in many countries there's stronger support for Obama than national presidents, which I just found fascinating. But there's a bit of a paradox there in that, you know, the anti-Americanism is a national pastime in so many countries. So there's a bit of a disconnect between, you know, what's said publicly and then what things really come down to attitudes. So I think it's a flag for questioning whatever anybody says and looking for nuance in it. And also the point that because there are so many Latino troops abroad for the United States, that, you know, relatives do tend to want to believe that they're there doing the right thing and they want to support them. So I think that may contribute to some of the attitudes as well. The strong preference for multilateral engagement, support for the UN, also comes, as José Miguel pointed out, from Latin American attitudes towards democracy and freedom. And also Latin Americans coming from a background of seeing themselves as citizens of the world. And again, we have the paradox in that, you know, they in the U.S. they might want to be called Cuban Americans or Mexican Americans rather than, you know, Latinos or Hispanics, or we use the words interchangeably in the report. So again, there's a sort of contradictory trend there. I think similarly on hunger and on climate change, those are issues where Latinos want to engage in the world. Then on immigration, Latinos get that, you know, whatever strange bugaboos exist in the popular imagination, you know, they get it. You know, they're like, what's the big problem? I was, you know, delighted. It sounds like in preparing his remarks this weekend, President Obama may have looked at a certain public opinion survey, given the messaging he came out with. I don't know that for a fact, but I would certainly like to think so. In think tanks, we like to think about the impact that we have and the people who adopt our ideas. So if that's true, we would certainly be very delighted. And then a couple of the other interesting overall big picture conclusions that came out of the discussions were one, this contradiction in that for many years, you know, going back as you've mentioned to the Alien and Sedition Act, there's this idea that somehow these foreigners coming in are going to undermine our national character and our foreign policy, and it's just all going to be terrible and horrible. And but at the same time, there's this importance of asking question. It's like nobody bothers to ask to find out if it's true otherwise. We actually did a presentation in Chicago of these results as well, and we had a very similar reaction from one of the panelists. We asked them what the most surprising thing was to them about the report, and he said, you know, the most surprising thing to me was that you bothered to ask. You know, people will ask about Latinos' preferences on immigration, but there seems to be an impression that that's all Latinos think about. And so that reinforced for us just how important this conversation is. But also this paradox that people may seem to think that that Latinos, that any immigrant group might undermine policy, but that at the same time that there's a very strong underrepresentation and undervoting level, and that this is not consistent with the public perceptions. And as usual, you know, perceptions and reality are often very, very different from each other. And then on the voting issue, I think that's very, very interesting. There are some very interesting groups, Voto Latino, that's trying to particularly reach out to youth, get them engaged politically, get them involved in voting and participating on these issues. And I think this question of having a voice, of being asked, is an important part of whether people are engaged, are included or not. And it'll be very interesting to see, and the question of, you know, are people going to engage? Look at who the role models are. Look at the messages that are going out, and I think that there could be a virtuous circle. That, you know, once you're asked and have the opportunity to have a voice, then you're more likely to do it, and then that goes forward. But we've also taken the very constructive feedback to heart, and are very much looking forward to continuing and deepening this work. And I want to thank all of you for your fantastic, fantastic questions, and to thank FIU for hosting this discussion. It's been really an honor to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Michele. Yes, and I also want to once again reiterate my thanks and appreciation to the Chicago Council. I hope, as Eduardo seemed to suggest that this is not the last time we'll collaborate together. We certainly look forward to future opportunities. I also want to thank you all for being here, and please join me in thanking one last time this wonderful panel.